Hey everyone. All right. So you know who I am. Okay, so let's talk about logical models first. And let's get something straight right at the start. Logical models is about the dumbest name you could have come up with. So that's what we're stuck with. Okay, so FHIR resources and data types and profiles are all defined by a set of element definition. And element definition is based on 11073. So each element definition has a path, which is the name of the element, the definitions, text definitions, types, various kinds of constraints, mappings, and example values, and even default values, although we do not use defaults in FHIR. And we all define those using the same pattern, and we developed the pattern and the tooling to support our use cases, to define data types, resources, and profiles. But it turns out that it's a pretty powerful type definition language. It's more comprehensive than any of the others that I've seen. We didn't set out to define a general type definition language. We just wanted to define our types, our content. But we ended up with a pretty powerful typing language. And then we started using that same definition pattern for other types, things that were not resources or data types or profiles on them. Without really thinking about it, I called them logical models because they weren't concrete models, as in they didn't have, they weren't resources. And then over the years, we just kept reusing the same technique of logical modeling. As I said, that's an awful name for it, but applying structure definition to define types, and we just kept doing that. And so we originally created them in order to do conceptual models. And it's not unusual to find those in IGs where people say, here's my understanding of the domain of interest in a single coherent model, but I'm going to have to break this up into a whole bunch of different resources and different profiles. I've got to consider regulatory constraints as well, and what other people are doing with the same content. So just because in my head it's a coherent whole, it's not going to be when I actually push it into a set of profiles. And sometimes we've called those clinical models, and we use them to explain profiles. We've also done some pretty other interesting things with logical models. We created a set of logical models for all the CDA classes, for those of you who've done CDA. We created a set of logical models for the CDS hooks, JSON structures. We have a set of logical models for HL7v2. I found this week a set of logical models for the SMART or the EU DDCC JSON structures. We have logical models for all the archetypes, OpenAir archetypes, and for web templates in OpenAir. And in fact, anything that's even roughly UML-like can be described with a set of structure definitions. It's just a hierarchical tree of data, which we describe in sometimes exquisite detail. And as I move around the community, one thing that I see is there is no other way that I know of to define data with such detail as we do. Okay, it's not a visual design language, but it's very comprehensive in terms of expressing the content of the data and the interrelationships with the data, and particularly binding to terminology, which you won't find in many other places, particularly not outside healthcare. So here's an example of some logical models. These are the CDS hooks logical models. They're currently in the tooling IG, but they're going to move out to the CDS hooks specification itself in the next ballot. And these properly describe the content that goes backwards and forwards in the CDS hooks exchanges. The UML diagram is almost completely generated by code. The way I do generation for profiles, not many people are using it because it's pretty recent, but I actually generate SVG diagrams. They look horrible because I don't pay any attention to trying to figure out a nice layout. That's your problem as the editor. And so I actually create the SVGs. You open them in Inkscape and move the classes around and then feed them back into input, and then you'll get these nice UML class diagrams. Here's another logical model taken from the EU MPD. A straight statement of, positive statement of a European prescription, which will then be turned into a set of profiles on a bunch of different resources. So that's kind of, what we originally constructed logical models for. But what if some of those things we described are actually pretty concrete? What if there was a way to map from the logical definitions to the wire formats? And I mean, if the wire format happens to be the same as the little FHIR logical model, there's a kind of a implicit transform from the structure definitions to the JSON and the XML formats, then you don't even really need to do that. Or if you're happy to accept whatever format, then you could just falls out of having a logical model. But if you can actually map from the logical definition to a particular wire format, if you can do that, then that means that you can take the logical model and load actual instances of that. The validator can validate them, the publisher can publish them, and FHIR code generators can generate for them. So what do we need to do to map to the wire formats? So I've been beavering away at this for a few years now, and I've come up with a bunch of extensions that sit inside structure definitions to explain how structure definitions get converted into wire formats. The bottom is the XML with things like choice groups that are not explicitly in the XML, name and namespace where the XML name is not a valid UML name, or saying that they come in no order. In JSON, to controlling what happens when the content's empty, an alternate name, some things around different JSON representations, the instruction that there's no actual resource type element. There'll be a few more added to this list, but if you take a logical model and mark up with these extensions to describe how it's represented in a wire format, and then you program the code generators and the parsers to understand those formats, then everything just becomes more content, more FHIR content that you can parse. And so we did that and leveraged that, for instance, with CDA. So there's a couple of links to the base CDA specification as represented in structure definitions, so logical models, and then the base CCDA specification. Now, the CCDA specification is now a fully FHIR based specification. All of the content is authored as profiles on the CDA logical model, and they are marked up with enough information in the structure definitions to allow for the validator, the FHIR validator, to parse and validate CDA documents. Now, they are the original CDA documents. They haven't changed at all. They're just fully described by FHIR logical models or FHIR structure definitions. And because the validator, and therefore the publisher, know how to read those structure definitions and then read the XML, it's just more content. Turns out you can do the same with open-air archetypes. So here's the same basic structure for open-air archetypes. From the top is the open-air reference model, represented as structure definitions. And then an example. If you go there right now, you'll find that it doesn't exist, but hopefully Lloyd and I will finally get ourselves aligned, and it will exist by the time we get home from this. It's waiting for me to do one more release of the IG Publisher. But then the OpenAir reference implementation guide is the same thing. The reference model is a set of base classes, not yet marked up with the JSON and XML rules for OpenAir, but they will be. And then the OpenAir test IG contains actual archetypes that are read and turned into profiles on the OpenAir reference model and then presented to the user as if they are not, or they could be presented to the user as if they're not OpenAir FHIR logical models. It's irrelevant to a user that they are. And then we can read and write archetype data as if it's more FHIR data. It's all the same thing to us. Now, we need to do more additional work here, and we met with OpenAir earlier this week, and the OpenAir community, they were looking at this, and they're thinking about what it means. But one possible thing they might choose to do, and I'll work with them on this, is actually to rewrite all the base specifications, for OpenAir-based specifications, as FHIR implementation guides with logical models for the reference model, and that would become their master format. So then all archetypes are just more FHIR data. It's possible, right? So this is a pretty powerful technique. So can you use logical models? Lots of you in the audience already do. And the answer is yes, completely, unrestricted. You can define logical models as much as you like. For whatever purpose you want, you can define them. You can define them to describe conceptual models that are only ever documentation in purpose. But you can also define them to define concrete formats that you are defining or that belong to other formats that you are capturing to describe. And as I said, those things are happening already. You can mark them up with format control so that you're actually describing the format. The format doesn't even need to be JSON or XML, although you will need my help if you're going to do that. So at least I need to support that in the validator. And then given that, you can provide instances as input either to the validator or the publisher. That is pretty straightforward. And lots of people doing that, and they'll be rendered like resources, treated like resources, and they can even be syntax highlighted. But for that, you need to work with Prism, which is the library that we use for syntax highlighting in IG publishers. So you are not constrained to FHIR, and I haven't yet seen a FHIR implementation guide that has nothing to do with FHIR, but it can't be long before I see one, right? Because just all logical models. And you can see why logical models is such an awful name, but we had no idea where it was going to go. And it just derives from the classification of the model in the structure definition. And so actually, here's another thought for you. If you can read and write these formats as if they're FHIR content, and if you can code generate for that, and if we do code generate for that, for instance, the happy FHIR code now includes generated code for reading and writing CDA and reading and writing OpenAir content, then happy, out of the box, could support those as like on endpoints, like resources. Like just what you do, or any other server could choose to do the same, right? You're going to have a CDA endpoint. There's some issues with that. If you wanted to do that, because what do you do about IDs? The CDA ID is not the same thing as the resource ID. You got work to do there if you wanted to do that. What do you do about searching? They don't have search definitions for those. Well, you could. So those are resolvable problems. So you could do that. I mean, it's not a FHIR endpoint, not a resource, but might be useful, right? And certainly for something like Happy, that would be pretty straightforward since I generated all of the actual object models, and they mostly, for OpenAir still it's mostly, for CDA it's absolute, they work because we publish CCDA that way. All right, so that's logical models. Now there's another use for logical models coming up, which is additional resources. So if you can define any kind of logical model, maybe you could actually define a new kind of resource of your own. Nobody would want to do that. All right, lots of people want to do that. And you could. You could totally subclass from resource and then not have the problems I just talked about around IDs and matching and persistence and just say, I'm defining my own resources. And in fact, lots of people do that already. They define their own resources and then they code them into their server and then they support custom resources. But we've never ever said anything about that in the specification. We've just said, if you want to do that as a server, you can do that. It's custom, it's not conformant. We're not going to take you out the back and beat on you for that, but we don't have anything to say about that. It's not supported. But you can define resources, and now we're finally going to start doing something about that and actually allow for official FHIR resources to be defined outside the specification. So the rest of my talk, I'm going to explain what that means, but why are we doing that now? So our main focus with Release 6 is stability. There's plenty of talk about that this week, as usual. We won't be making breaking changes once we publish Release 6. That stuff, solid. We will have a regular stately publication cadence of minor enhancements to the specification, but we won't be breaking stuff because we're done. And so that is very much our goal, and we're working very hard towards that. But the need for iterative development of new content, the way we work up content, that's not gone away. And we certainly know that when you start with new content, the only way to get it to work is to iterate with the community. That part of FHIR has worked super well, so well that we are hard to get us unaddicted to that and actually go for stability. But we do need to do that. And there's some content currently in R6. I mean, some of you will know this content. It is not ready. It is not ready for us to freeze it and say, right, we're done. It's maturity level 1 or 0 at the moment. It's too big a lift. So how do we resolve that tension? And the way we're going to resolve that tension is by saying some of these resources are going to move out of the spec, and new things that we're yet to add to the specification because we agree to take a problem on will first of all be developed and mature outside the core specification. And they will finally, when we're happy with them and they're solid, then they'll make their way into the specification and then they'll all be stable. So, additional resources, that's what we decided to call them. That name is not yet fixed in stone, and some people have told me they think that's a terrible name. Of course, the great thing about that is the people who told me that mostly advanced alternative terrible names. So we call them Geno favourites. That will work. So that name is potentially subject to change, but additional resources are new resources that are planned to become part of the specification in the future, treated as if they were specification resources, but actually defined in implementation guides for now. Why implementation guides? Because the whole world's getting eaten by implementation guides, so why would we do anything different? And it has all of the infrastructure and machinery and publishing support and so forth for us to do that. And then the implementation guides will roll over as quickly as the community wants for that particular module, potentially every month, probably slower than that. And typically it starts out pretty quick and slows down. And then they will iterate quickly until we look at them and go, yep, met the maturity requirements, really need to nail this. The community doesn't want us to be changing it anymore. Time to migrate into the next release of the specification and nail it. Okay, so how does this work? First thing I want to talk about is governance, and from here on in, I'm basically quoting from this draft R6 spec that we balloted in April. So, additional resources to be used like this shall be registered with HL7. It's not a free-for-all. If you want to have one of these, you need to register with HL7, and FMG, the FHIR Management Group, needs to approve this. Unapproved resources shall not be used. I'll come back to that. So you have to have approval. Registered and approved resources are given a name by us, HL7, And then that is the name that must be used for the resource. So there's not, and that name will be the name that it has when it comes into the core specification. And so it has to fit into our naming and design proposals to be part of the specification. All such registered and approved resources shall have a publicly available definition, base structure definition, published in an IG and published at the canonical URL. So there's never any question about where to find it. And the definitions will be reviewed for quality by HL7 and FMG prior to approval on an ongoing basis. And most of them will actually be subject directly to the authority of FMG anyway. So how do they work? So first of all, the list of registered resources that we've approved and that therefore can be used will be published in a public location. Currently, the draft location is right here. It'll probably move, but it's actually a code system, and here's a sample entry for what goes in there. View definition has a definition, a tabular projection of a FHIR resource, column inclusion criteria are defined by FHIR path expressions. This is being worked up by the SQL on FHIR project. It will eventually become a resource. That's the plan. And you see that it has two properties. The URL where the definition can be found, and the canonical, the formal identifier for the resource. And so only the entries in here are the ones that can be used when you actually try to use additional resources. And that is under the control of the FHIR management group. And then when you actually run into them in the wire, either JSON or XML, you have a resource type definition like usual, a field, that's view definition. That's the name that we gave it to it. The name will be staying and will be fixed. And then you have all the normal content like ID, etc., but you have an extra field, resource definition. And that is a reference to the canonical with version. And that points to the definition. So when you're reading this as a resource consumer, you get to the view resource type and say, I don't know this resource type. In R6, you can say, but do I know the definition? So you can either go to the definition and say, hey, I found a definition. I'm good to just go off and retrieve the definition and do my business based on the definition of the resource. Or you can say, well, I don't know what it is, I'll just ignore it. Or you can say, I don't know what it is, I will not process the whole content. That's your decision. It's the same as if you don't know it. Or you can say, I do know this. I already know the definition and the version matches, so I'm going to go ahead and process based on my knowledge of this resource. If you're a happy user, probably, and James and I are still talking about this, happy will not fetch definitions on the fly and try generating code on the fly or anything like that. Might be a build step. But if I run into a resource type, maybe I'm going to have a stub that just loads all the content and says, well, it's something, I don't know what it is, but it's here in case you want to plow through the content anyway. We're still talking about exactly how that'll work. But for build type stuff, for happy users, to dive into happy for a second, we will generate a separate package that contains the definitions as defined by this and other content and implementation guide. And then there will be a registration step that you take to register this with your operating infrastructure so that you know these extra resources. And the other reference implementations, C# or .NET and so forth, will basically follow a similar pattern where you can register generated code or stub placeholders or something similar for what to use when you run into these examples of additional resources. It's worth pointing out at this point that this matters, this version matters, because the whole point is that these will roll over quickly relative to the rest of the content, which is frozen. So in this case, version is there and matters, and you actually have to check the version when you decide whether you know the content supported, and there is no promise of no breaking change in this content. That's the point of keeping this content separate, is that it can and will. So you have to pay attention to the version. We added a new field. So those are not extensions also. They are not extensions. They're format things, right? They're in the format. So they're not in the definitions anywhere. They're features of the format itself. And then we added a new element in the capability statement. So in the capability statement where you're declaring what features and resources you support, you name the resources using their official name, but because they're additional resources, you also say, here they are, this is the canonical definition. And then the canonical definition points you to the definition. And if you need to know, you can go off and read that master registry. So additional resources are defined by structured definition resources. Well, they're not actually logical models, they're resources. There's a bunch of rules which I will not trouble myself with, except for one of them. The base definition shall be a direct reference to one of the abstract resources. Resource, domain resource, canonical resource, or metadata resource. It will inherit from one of those as a specialization. The rest is predictable if you know how structured definitions work. So, additional resources are not a free-for-all. The rules do allow for HL7 to delegate authority to other organisations. The example that I showed you, the SQL on FHIR view definition, is not actually maintained by HL7. And so it is not an approved resource at this time. It is just the example that I used to demonstrate how it would work. Well, we may choose to delegate authority to the SQL on FHIR group to do that. They've done a good job so far, so maybe we could do that. It's possible that some other organisation, IHE, I don't know, could come to us and say, we think there should be a new resource and we want to work it up. And we will say, approving this as an additional resource is subject to the same existing rules we have for resources today. But sure, your proposal and scope, maybe we will delegate to an organisation like IHE, but it would have to be a pretty well-established, community-based, process-controlled, standards kind of group for us to decide to do that. We could, but we're not just going to turn around and say, oh yeah, sure, that's fine. And we're not going to say that, anything you want to create, we're going to approve. It has to be a candidate resource to go in the base spec. Now it's possible, every so often, Dan or Chuck or myself get approached by other industries. I've had approaches from the insurance industry, from the real estate management industry, from the intelligence industry, from the air safety aviation regulators, and a couple of others. And they've all basically said the same thing. There is nothing like FHIR out there. It is the only thing in its class. And there is one other that I know of, which is SCIM for user and group management. But we are much bigger and broader and regulatory friendly than SCIM, and there's nothing else like what we have. And so they come to us and say, we really, really, really want to reuse everything that you have, but just in a different domain. So it's possible this might be a tool in that case. But maybe not, because although those discussions do happen, those discussions generally don't go anywhere, because if you're going to build a community, which is what you need to do, you need to be in control of your own life and your own content. And if you're just reusing everything we've got, you're our slave, right? We're in control of you. And so that's a pretty hard value proposition to pull together. And so for now, none of them have gone anywhere. They just haven't been able to close all the dots on that. So maybe that won't happen. So what about custom resources? As I said, many servers have them. There's no change in their status. Although we said you shall not use any other kind of additional resources, the servers already doing that are not being conformant. So it would be nothing new to say, well, we won't follow that rule. It doesn't change the status there. It actually gives you better hooks, both in the format and in the reference implementations, to go ahead and do custom resources. It's not going to change our policy about them. It's not going to change the fact that you go and do them, and we're not going to suddenly make that worse than it was. We just actually sort of regularise the infrastructure for them. But it hasn't changed anything there. So that's what I have to say. Hopefully that gave you a good picture of where we are. And now I'm looking forward to plenty of questions.
Hey, Grahame, thanks for the talk and also thanks for working on this. I have a question about the approval process. Have you thought about applying FHIR's maturity model process where you have to have a certain amount of implementations, implementing like most of the resource for it to go up in the scale to the additional resource approval?
Oh, there's no question that the maturity model will apply. The same maturity model will apply. We're working up resources. The maturity model itself will change this year because we've got to account in the maturity model more for actual adoption and implementation weight. But actually, since we are working up resources, it will be the same model.
You talked about, for example, expressing archetypes in logical models. How would you compare this approach with OpenAI's ADL?
It's the same approach. It's a different syntax for the same functionality. And they are considering adopting the technology since it's conceptually the same approach. From the beginning, when I did the base FHIR design, I read ADL and consider this flattery. I flattered ADL, OpenAI, by copying as much methodology from them as I could. And so OpenAI and FHIR don't really differ at the methodology level. I mean, there's one difference. ADL allows choices at the entry route and we don't. That is how close we are.
Yeah, okay.
But we are much more thorough in terms of terminology and constraints and so forth. But, we're a superset of what they've got at that level.
Okay, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. I was wondering how the wire format logical model stuff relates to structure map and FML, because I feel like there's a bit of overlap going on there.
So the structure map basically anticipates that there is a definition, and that the definition, the actual implementation, in order to actually get the data to feed it into the structure map, it's basically off the scene, and it's delegated to the definitions. And so one of the reasons that we do some of these logical models with format control is precisely so that we can then feed them into structure maps so that we have a meaningful way of actually, first of all, describing what we're doing and then actually doing it. And so the happy implementation of structure maps fully empowered by logical models and drives that way. So if you can, let's take, you should, and I think Oliver does this directly. You have a logical model for CDA, and so you let all the CDA content by the logical model and then just feed it into the structure maps, so the structure maps are written against the CDA logical model, and that's how it all works. But you don't have to have a structure definition. You can, in your implementation of structure map processing, the FML implementation, you can feed the definitions in any way you want. You don't have to have, so that's why the definition's not explicit in structure map, so that you can do that and say that you know, we have implicit feeders of the data. Now, does that's clear?
A lot of good work, Grahame. And I already filed the ticket for it, and this is more just to be on the record for watching, but you can't use canonical and metadata as base. You use domain resource and say it imposes. We do that in all of our resources today because you don't actually implement the interface in inheritance trees. So I already filed the ticket, but we can't do that internally even. So
I think you're wrong.
no, I double checked. We have a ticket that resolves it too, that we agreed on that. Because the problem is you don't actually have to implement all of the elements of the interface, and if you put it in the inheritance tree, you do. And so that was the argument we had. And so like all of the canonical and metadata resources use domain resource as the base, and then have a specific extension that tells you that you implement the interface.
I thought I was going to change that.
We can argue. We're up on our HL7 memberships.
Right, that's what we're here for. That's what we're good for. None of this was, well, I do have to say, I tell you all that you can blame Gino for all of the additional resources stuff because it was his idea. You can blame me for the implementation, you can blame Gino for the idea.
A detailed question, what happens with the canonicals of the resources that are not mature enough to be part of the core? Will they change to be part of an IG and therefore the canonical will change, or they remain the same?
Canonical will change in time, yes. But the wire format will not. Or nor will the name.
Questions over here? Anybody? Yep, okay.
Thank you, Grahame and Gina, for additional resources. My question is for the logical models, so it's supposed to be mapped to the profiles and FHIR resources. Is there any like machine readable way you envision to describe this?
Yes and no. And you can describe it now with concept maps or structure maps. For everybody, they do different things. Concept map says that this element conceptually matches this element, and that if you are mapping data, you would do it roughly here. Structure maps go an extra step and say, if you are migrating data, this is how you do it. A much more complicated thing to do, but you can do it at either level. On the other hand, just because we have those doesn't mean that we leverage them properly or that we have made most advantage of them. So one of my projects, once I stop traveling, you can laugh now, is to actually really leverage that in the infrastructure and make it much more computable and processable by example. So watch this space.
Any other questions?
So for additional resources, when they get to a maturity level of normative, will that automatically be when they would be added to the main spec, or will there be, like, they would have to go normative and then an additional step would be to add them to the main spec?
Like, I don't know what the exact sequence would be. That's fairly over the horizon, but I don't know why we would maintain them in an IG when they belong in the core spec once they're stable-ish. Exactly how stable, yeah, exactly what the steps are, yeah, that's over the horizon at the moment.
Yeah, just trying to put on my FMG hat, I would argue at least that they go normative in the core spec already, because we don't want to have a different version in the resource definition, and we don't want to deal with any of those changes. I don't even know if we could if it went normative externally, because if we're changing those things, that would probably be considered breaking under the normative rules. So probably it needs to be in core spec before it can be normative.
Yeah, probably, yeah. Of course, we will argue about that, right? Because that's what we do.
Come visit us at FMG.
I'm dazed and confused.
Well, I've achieved my goal if Diego's confused.
So usually my advice when I was in some country and the program director told me, what happens if I want to create my own? And I always said to them, why would you do that? And sometimes they have their reasons. And usually the advice was use BASIC and add extensions. And that was something that I don't like it.
Nobody
but
does.
Still, it's in our schema. And it works in most of the implementations. It doesn't matter which one, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, they support that.
Yep.
And it's documented. And then I saw it in some implementation guides. When they don't have even HS7 implementation guide, when they don't have the content, they create the BASIC and some extensions. Would you say that that is not a recommended way to do this? Or, because in fact, a logical model can be just a BASIC with all the elements and extensions. I don't like it. So I want your comments on this.
So nothing's really changed in your question space. The additional resources are for modularizing the specification, and doesn't change that. And it's already true, and has been true for a number of years, that you can use logical models to define your own exchange formats, and people do, but it doesn't change the advice is that anything that you do like that, although it works, it's private to your little agreement, your own club. It's certainly not a good idea for nation states to do that. That's problematic. You're inviting a huge amount of problems to do that. It's something that vendors, particularly applications where they're really not doing interoperability, they're just using FHIR as a platform for an application, and it makes more sense in that context to just go, we'll just define our own resources because it's for us. And so it's much more common there. And honestly, if you're in that context, I would not expect you to like using BASIC like that. But if you're in an interoperability context, yeah, you really should. You shouldn't make up your own stuff because it's your own club. And nothing that I've talked about here today changes that we already have those decisions and we already give that advice.
And just following up on that a little bit, I think one of the main differences is if you want to stick something into a bundle, right now it has to be a proper resource, and therefore you can use BASIC to make anything a proper resource. In this new world with additional resources, to be an official additional resource, it has to be approved by HL7, and then it can go into a bundle. And if you're following just creating arbitrary logical models, we don't yet have a formal way to include those in bundles alongside other FHIR resources.
Right, but if you're in a world where you're in control and you're defining custom models already, you can just use them in bundles because you decide that you will.
Right, but that would not be FHIR conformant.
No, it certainly wouldn't be.
Have time for maybe one more question? Anybody?
Where this field resource definition coming from? Is it like in a base resource or it's a magical element? And can I use it for core resources to pin the version?
It's defined in the format, so magic if you want. You can do whatever you want with it, but that would not be conformant. It is only for referring to additional resources. But like I said, actually, in a sense, it regularizes the infrastructure by which you do custom resources. And if you decided that you were going to mix versions and you could use it like this, that will not be conformant. We won't be doing that, but you could do that. Yes. And Nikolai, since I said that, Nikolai is very much in the world of application platform rather than interoperability. And so Nikolai likes doing that stuff. That's fine. All right, well, that was the last question. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy lunch.